Hey History 8, this is our video for Wednesday. I have to hold my phone because the printer decided it didn't want to have any more ink, so I couldn't print the pictures. And I don't know if you know this, iPhones, you can't flip around the camera once you're recording, which is great fun. So that's kind of what's happening today. I'm going to show you some pictures on my computer screen. Hopefully you can see them. And we're going to talk through this lesson. Hopefully a little bit faster so I don't have to hold this for 25 minutes or 20 minutes. All right, so last time we were talking about farmers, and we mainly talked about, though, cowboys and getting cattle to market. And today we're going to talk about homesteaders. These are people who moved west and kind of lived there. And so the prospect of just having fertile soil and just a new lifestyle kind of encouraged people to move west. And so Easterners who went, but they were also joined by immigrants, former slaves, and war veterans, and they're all just kind of looking for a new place to live. And so as more farmers went west, the space left for like open grazing, like we talked about with those taking cows to market, that just kind of ended. They just didn't have these open ranges anymore for cattle. Obviously, farmers don't want cattle on their land eating all of their crops. And so cattlemen fought the homesteaders for quite a while. They would destroy fences. They would threaten farmers. There were even some range wars that occurred. But cattlemen eventually changed their tactics. A lot of them became ranchers. And so they got their own land, or they would rent some land from the government. And they would just raise their cattle and then take them to market later in the year. Now, then the government passes the Homestead Act of 1862, and that opened Western land for free settlement. And what you would get is 160 acres. It's not as much land as you would think. It sounds like a lot, but it's really not. And they were given that land to sustain their family. And what it was is you had 5 years to develop the land, and you had to live on the land. So you had to improve it in some way in 5 years. If you did that, you actually got to keep the land. Some settlers, though, would just live on the land seasonally, and that was technically allowed as long as they had developed and improved the land. Now, there were several things that reasons the government did this. One was statehood. The more people that are living there, the faster they can get to statehood. Number two, there's a lot of economic opportunities. It expands those. There's a lot of goods you find as you go west. And there's also just more markets for goods from the east. So it just kind of encourages all the way around. Now, 160 acres, like I said, is not a lot. So you could buy extra land, and it was like 120 or $1.25 an acre. And the smallest amount you could buy was 40 acres. So that was about $50. And like if they filed a timber claim and planted 10 acres of trees, they could add another quarter section to their holdings. So they just kind of had some deals for people. And they gobbled up like 224,550 acres in Kentucky and Nebraska, just those two states. And the railroads also were selling land. They had bought land to build up their railroads, and they just bought kind of too much. They buy it too wide, and then would sell it later. And so they were selling at a $250 an acre. And so, yeah, there's just a lot of, ways that you could buy land. They also would pay immigration bureaus to just attract people from other countries to come here too and take land. And then there was the Land Grant Act, the Morrill Land Grant Act of 1862, and it gave states 30,000 acres of federal land for every representative and senator they had. And the land, like the proceeds from this, was used to establish the land grant colleges. And the problem is, though, you have a lot of speculators who would buy this land, so they would buy it and then raise the price and sell it for more. That was a risk because you just never know if people will actually buy it, but most of the time it was successful. Then we have one more area that was not settled by the United States, and that was Oklahoma. The government had moved the Cherokee and many other Indian tribes to what they called the Indian Territory, which later is Oklahoma. It later moved even more tribes on there. They were all farming tribes, so it's a good place for them to be. And so most of the other desirable farmland in the West was claimed, and so people kept looking at Oklahoma like, why do they get that land? We want that land. And of course, speculators see it as a way to make more money. And so they're pushing the federal government to open Oklahoma for settling. In 1885, the government bought land in the Indian Territory. President Benjamin Harrison announced that some of the land would be open and available at noon on April 22nd, 1889. They actually sent in the army to kind of block people from settling before that time. Obviously, there were some people who snuck in because you can't completely surround the border, obviously. The people who went illegally, or actually the people who went in to get land were called boomers. The ones who went in illegally were called Sooners. And settlers claimed about 1.9 million acres in just a couple hours, which is just kind of crazy. And Oklahoma is the last like land rush for, mainland United States. And it's really like there's not like a huge land rush in Alaska or Hawaii anyway. So this is the last land rush. In 1893, government officials opened another part of Oklahoma for settlement. This is actually the Cherokee outlet where the Indians had just been put by the government. It's just kind of too bad. And then Oklahoma was made a territory in 1890, and then in 1907, Teddy Roosevelt made it the Sooner state in the Union. It was a 46th state added, so we're almost done building the United States. The problem is, though, there are some issues. First of all, remember we talked about trees last time. There's just not a whole lot of trees, so wood is scarce, and it had to be brought in from other places. Well, that's expensive, and log cabins are expensive, and they just don't make sense in that area. And so a lot of them would take sod, which is grass and soil, and they would dig out, braced by just a few boards. They were kind of dreary. If you can imagine, it's dirt. Sometimes they would just like carve it into a hillside. Does not look like something you want to live in. Here's some. Okay, this is harder than I thought it would be. Here's some pictures. There's the guy, you can see him standing outside of his. You can see there's wood that he used to build it. Doesn't look like a great place to live. And then, oh my gosh, this is harder than I thought. You can see this one as well. Yeah, look how exciting that, what an amazing place to live. Here's another one where they actually built it like independently, so it's not carved into a hill. It does look pretty sturdy. I could not imagine living there. Look at that one, crazy. All right, I'm going to flip this way because my arm is getting tired. Okay, so let's see. It was dry, sturdier. If they could make it, the second, well, I guess third picture I showed you, those are way more comfortable to live in. If you look at those first ones, they just don't look that comfortable to live in because they're, I don't know, they look not so tall. They're not tall. They just look uncomfortable. They're a lot darker. This one seems to have windows in it that I showed you. And so, but if you can imagine it's not comfortable, they would actually do kind of like bricks. They would take the sod and, make it into like a brick home. They would put grass side down. They were warm in the winter and cooler in the summer. And usually a settler would weave willow branches and cover it with clay from a nearby creek to form like the base of the roof. Then they would put sod shingles over the base. And in heavy rains, though, if you can imagine, it just kind of leaked like soaked sponges. So debris would fall from the roofs. But a lot of times the wives would hang cheesecloth or muslin below the rafters to kind of catch the mud and bugs. But yeah, not a fun place to live. But they kind of did what they had to do. Inside, a lot of times they would whitewash it with a mixture of lime and sand. And tight construction was so important, obviously not just because of the temperature, but also to keep out snakes and field mice. And so a few of them were built with some lumber, and some of them, they were so sturdy that they actually made them 2 stories high. But there's a problem here. We talked about there's no wood for homes. There's also no wood for fires. Like, how do you build a fire at night when you don't have wood? You have to become kind of creative. So they would use corn cobs, they would use hay, sometimes even manure, buffalo chips, to I can't think, to burn for fire. So your code word, by the way, today is buffalo chip, because why not? It's technically 2 words, but so buffalo chip is your word for the day. All right, so anyway, another issue was that because they don't have wood, they can't build fences. And so that's obviously a problem as well. Another issue is there's no stones, so they can't even use stones to build fences. And so that's a major problem. Another thing is water. Water is pretty scarce on the plains. They don't have just like a lot of lakes and rivers. They have some, but just not enough. And so they would have rain barrels. to collect rain, but again, it's just not great. Some would settle near creeks, but sometimes those would dry up. Most of them found water by digging wells, but they had to be super deep to reach water, and they could not pump enough water by hand. So the invention of the windmill really made a difference later. All right, so next page. They did get pretty smart, though. They started raising crops that required less water, and they would use dry farming techniques. Like some farmers would use mulch to keep the moisture in to help, and that way they didn't need as much water. But there's a lot of hazards. I'm going to talk about some of those. I made a list. So one of those is wind and dust. One of the biggest issues they have is just these wind storms that would come in, and it would blow the dust, and it was so dirty and grimy, and you're like, oh, whatever, it's dirt. But look at this picture here. You can kind of, I think you can see that pretty well. That's dust. It looks almost like a tornado or like a fire or something. That's just dust. If you can imagine, that would destroy things very quickly. It was blinding. And another issue was it would take all the topsoil off the land. And so you would lose a lot of the nutrients from the ground because it would blow away. The second thing was a prairie fire, especially as it got dry. Any small spark could cause everything to go up in flames. And like their sod houses, they were usually pretty safe in those, but like there was nothing they could do. It's not like they had water to put out the fires or hoses. It says that sometimes people would use damp clothing and blankets to beat out the small fires. Sometimes they would actually use carcasses of dead animals to try to put it out. But a lot of times they just had to wait it out and pray, but they would lose all of their crops very quickly. Another thing were hailstorms and tornadoes. If you think about like Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, those are called Tornado Alley. They're a part of Tornado Alley. They have tornadoes a lot. It's just kind of a common thing in the spring, especially in summer. And so they would sometimes come out in, especially hailstorms, and destroy crops, so quickly. Another issue were locusts and grasshoppers. They would come in and they would just swarm, especially in the 1870s. It said they devoured everything that grew. It says they even ate like door frames and any fence posts they might have, leather boots, tree bark. Here's a picture of a locust. I think they're like one of the grossest bugs, just kind of nasty. And the other problem was you had them for 2 years because they would come through the one summer and then the next summer their eggs would hatch and you'd have them again. And it actually said, this is so disgusting, that at one point there are reports that they were 6 inches deep on the ground. Like that's how thick they were. So that's just devastating. And then another issue is just loneliness. You're out in the middle of nowhere. Houses were not close together. And so just people get lonely after a while. And so there were a couple of things that helped this loneliness. One of them was the post office started doing, I have a picture, by the way, I forgot, of the destruction of locusts. You can just kind of see, like, look at that. They left everything bare. All right, so anyway, so there were some things that came in that kind of helped. One of those was rural free delivery. So what it used to be is it cost way more to ship a letter out to, like, the West, especially like sod houses and stuff. It cost more to ship things. And so what they did is they passed this so that it cost no more for a letter to be sent like within New York City than it did to like the West. And that's kind of like today, you either pay the same amount for a stamp as long as it doesn't weigh more. And they also had mail order catalog. And so there were stores that would send out catalogs and you could order from them. The first one, which you guys, 8th grade, should be familiar with, kind of, is Montgomery Ward and Company. This one was actually, remember that story you read in Lit last week, Monty and the Barter Store, or whatever the title is? He started Montgomery Ward, and another store that started in Chicago in 1872, and then Sears, Roebuck and Company started as well. Sears is still around, and so is Montgomery Ward. They're mainly online now, though. And so what they did is they literally would send a magazine and you could order what you wanted out of this magazine, which is genius because these guys were out in the middle of nowhere. Now they can order things. Kind of like we can order online. They just got, a catalog in the mail and then could send in. It took a while though because you would get the catalog, then you'd send in, your order with your money, and then it would take a while for you to get your order. So you had to be very patient, you know. Nowadays, even when you go to order something and it takes longer on Amazon, it's like more than 2 days. What? So anyway, so yeah, it was just kind of cool that you could order things. And then another thing was they had social groups. The Grange was one. It was a social organization, but it actually became a political tool, and they used it to help farmers. And it actually became like a third-party political movement. So that's kind of neat. Another help that came around was the development of barbed wire. You guys may be familiar with it, but maybe not. It was founded in Illinois by Joseph Glidden. So if you have been to DeKalb, you can actually go, I think, tour the Joseph Glidden home. That's where he's from. And you can kind of see that. That's why like Annie Glidden Road, that's his wife. Which is just kind of cool. And so what he did is he used part of a coffee grinder to cut and coil small lengths of wire, and then strung the barbs on by hand. And then there was a machine that would later do the work. And within a year, or no, just kidding. I was like, a year, wow. Within a decade, I can't read, 120 million pounds of wire were being sold per year. That's why I got that. And that was just something that made a huge difference, especially for those in the West. I do have a video that I want you to watch, as long as it works. It should work, on barbed wire, so I will be putting that below. So make sure you watch that. Another thing is railroads really helped as they got further west. Windmills made a difference for farmers as well. There's a windmill that actually had like a pump on it. Or no, this one like used a certain type of force, centrifugal force to face the wind. And it really helped pumped the water up out of the ground. And then obviously the steel plow makes a huge difference for farmers. So these are just a couple of things that really help them. Don't forget to send me your code word. And another thing is that we are on Friday going to talk about outlaws. And I am so excited about it. So I think I'm going to pick 2 and talk a little bit more in detail about them. And then the rest of them we'll just talk about. So I'm so excited about that. I hope you guys are excited about it too. And I will see you here on Friday. Have a great day.